There are 5 different watercolor techniques that we are going to go through. You need a set of watercolors. Make sure that it has a paintbrush, a jug of water, a paper towel, and your practice paper. Quick reminder for the brush that you have the bristles, the ferrule, which is the metal piece, and then the handle. You can touch the ferrule and the handle only. Please do not touch the bristles. You want for the bristles to be in pretty good condition, and you need to be very gentle with them. So you're going, in one direction or another. Don't, scrub or smash the bristles. You want them to stay nice in the shape that they are. All right, let's get going. I'm going to zoom in so you won't see my water jug, but remember that it is very important that you clean your brush very well from going when you're going from one color to a different one, particularly especially when you're going into your lighter colors. Those get messy very quickly. Start by folding your paper in half. You're going to open that back up, and if you'd like, you can draw a line down the crease. We're then going to fold each of those sections in half. Open up, draw a line down the crease, and do the same on the other side. Open back up and draw a line down the crease. So you should have 4 boxes side by side here, and on the last one we're going to be doing 2 different techniques in the same box. So I want you to go about halfway and draw that horizontal line straight across. So now we have 5 sections, 3 larger and then 2 smaller at the end. And we're going to label these. The first one is going to be labeled wet on dry. The second is wet on wet. The third is dry brush. The fourth is a flat wash. And our last box is a gradient wash. For these first 2 techniques, wet on dry and wet on wet, those names talk about the brush and the paper. The first word is what the quality of our brush is, and the second is the quality of the paper. So for wet on dry, we're going to have a lot of watercolor on the brush, and then we're working on dry paper. When you're working with your watercolor, you want to make sure that you take clean water from your water jug, and you're trying to make a nice puddle in your palette. And we're really not trying to pick up a lot of paint itself. You're really just trying to pick up pretty much dirty water that has the color soaked in. So I've got some orange here, and I'm making sure not to dig to the bottom of the palette here. I just want to touch where the puddle is at the top so I don't get a big glob of paint on there. And you can just go ahead and make whatever marks you'd like with your brush. You'll notice that as I go longer with the brush stroke and more of the color is getting transferred to the paper, that brush stroke gets lighter and lighter. So that certainly is something that you can consider as well, is if you're wanting a very strong dark mark, that you want to make sure that you have tons of color on your brush. And if you're wanting it to be lighter, you want maybe to dab a little bit extra off on your paper towel, or work in one spot where you need strong color versus another spot where you need a little less. Whenever you go from one color to another, make sure that you clean your brush very, very well. The color pots will get contaminated very easily, especially when you are looking at the going from a darker color to a lighter color. So I'm going to go ahead and change colors here. I'll go ahead and do blue. One thing that I want you to pay attention to when you're working with the wet on dry is that the edge of your brush stroke is very crisp and strong. There's, a very clean line from the outline of your brush stroke there. So that is something to pay attention to. If you're needing a very clean outline, wet on dry is a good way to go. Our next technique, wet on wet, the paint on the paintbrush is going to be very wet, lots of water, and we also need to wet our paper first. So I'm going to take clean water from my water jug and cover this section of my paper, being careful to keep the water only where I want the color to go. One cool thing about wet on wet is you can make a design with your water, and I'm not going to fill the whole thing. We'll give a little design, and that'll show up once I put my pigment and touch it to the paper. But you want to make sure that you have enough water on the paper that you see a little bit of a sheen, but not so much that you have a gigantic puddle. So it needs to be kind of in the middle there. Just wet enough, but not too wet. I'm going to pick up a good amount of the watercolor there. Remember, I'm only touching the puddle. I'm not trying to pick up a ton of physical paint. And as you can see, with the wet on wet, my paint is moving and flowing across the paper where the water is, and anywhere that I did not put water is staying the same. So you can do some really cool stuff with making designs and skipping certain areas. You can kind of like a tie-dye sort of look. And this can be really fun too for if you are mixing colors. So I'll get some blue in here and let the blue and the violet kind of mix. Again, you want to make sure that you're being very careful when you're going from one color to the next so that they don't get contaminated. We're going to let this blue swirl and mix in some spaces with the violet. And so I'll have some nice darker violet sections, some blue violet, along with my straight purple and even some sections of straight blue. So definitely you have, especially where you see one color working towards the next, it is a lot more fuzzy. So this is definitely the counterpart for the wet on dry. Anytime I'm going to make a mark on the wet paper, it is not going to be a very strong outline, but it'll be a little fuzzier and softer. which can be good for many different textures. You just need to know which one you want to use. You also, with the wet on wet, can let your color kind of move and flow on top of the paper as well by tilting your paper, and that'll get it to kind of travel and flow. For dry brush, this one you need to make sure that you get as much moisture off of your brush as you possibly can. And it looks like I still have some green on my brush. Good, get that cleaned off. So you can take your paper towel and just lightly squeeze the bristles, so that way most of the moisture comes out of the bristles, so we're not adding any extra moisture to the brush, except for just picking up a little bit of that paint. So remember, I am touching right at the top of that puddle that I have in my palette. And for dry brush, sometimes it's good to actually wipe off excess as well onto your paper towel before you get going. With dry brush, you want to touch the paper very lightly. And what you're looking for is this kind of snowy effect that happens when you're using a dry brush. If you can see here, there's, you know, earlier on I have a little bit more watercolor on my brush, so I'm just getting like the very end of the stroke has that little texture to it. And then later on, as it gets further and further away, that texture really shows up a lot more. This can be very nice for things like grass, rocks, texture of things that are rough, gravel and dirt, things like that. Can be very good with dry brush. Now, because you don't have a lot of color on your brush, not a lot of water, it's not going to move very much, and you really don't want to use this to cover a very large area. You would use it for a small bit of texture. Our last two techniques are the flat wash and gradient wash. These are ways that you would want to cover a large amount of paper at one time. A flat wash, you're trying to have a flat value, which is why it's called a flat wash. You want to make sure to have, you know, whatever color you've chosen has a pretty good puddle in the palette mixed up. And you want to use the same color for both the flat wash and the gradient wash, just so you can really see the difference between the two and not have to worry about figuring the different colors. So for the flat wash, what I'm trying to do is use the same amount of water and watercolor the whole time. So each time I need to add a little bit more space to my wash, I'm going back to my palette and getting a little bit more paint, and you can see it traveling across the page there. What I'm trying to do is carefully move the paint so that way I can get as smooth of a flat wash as possible. I want to try and have no spots that are really darker or lighter. I'm trying to have as even of an area as I possibly can. Okay, pretty good there. For my gradient wash, again, I'm going to use the same color, so I'm going to go back with the blue and pick up a good amount of watercolor. And I'm going to go from dark to light. So I want to put a lot of watercolor on one end. So I'm going to go and go back to my palette 2 or 3 times just so I have a good amount of watercolor built up over here. And then I'm going to move my brush down so that way that area gets a little bit larger. And then I'm going to dip some fresh water onto my brush and touch right next to where my color ended. Get a little bit more fresh water on my brush. Again, touch where that ended, and you can see that the watercolor is starting to travel down the page, and I can always go back through and get that to even out a little bit. Clean some of that off of my brush so that way as I get down to the bottom, I'm not adding any darkness. I want to try and get this as smooth of a gradient from dark to light as possible. And if I need to, I can always go back and add a little bit more dark up here at the top if I need there to be more value and transition. And then I would want to move that down my gradient. Again, it'll get lighter and lighter as I go until all the way at the bottom, where it just kind of fades out. Okay, so again, with my flat wash, I want it to be all the same even value, as even as I can make it. And with a gradient wash, I want my paper on one edge to be dark, and then goes to medium, and then to light, as smoothly as I possibly can get it to do that. If there's a space that's a little bit too dark, you can always very gently and lightly coax that watercolor where it needs to go. So that way it's a little bit more dispersed and you don't have anything pooling. And move that color down a bit more. So you can always kind of go back in and adjust it a little bit until it fully dries. Okay, there we go. One thing too that you want to make sure of is, especially if you're wanting to work a couple different techniques in one spot, you want to make sure, for example, if I wanted to do a really nice wash and do some really cool wet on wet over here, but then I needed some very strong dark lines on top of that, you certainly can do that. You just need to wait for this to dry. So now that it's been a little bit and this paper is mostly dry, now I could take my paintbrush and do some wet on dry and get some very strong lines on top of that. So once you have a spot on your paper that's dry, you can go back on top and you don't have to worry about it bleeding. But you do have to wait for it to dry to be able to do that. If I am working on a spot of my paper over here, let's say I'm just finished working with my wet on wet technique and I decide that I want to add a little bit of orange and I really want this wet on dry, really strong crisp line. You'll notice where the paper is dry, it is strong and crisp, and then the second I get to that wet paper, it starts to bleed and fray. So you really do need to make sure that you are paying very close attention to what parts of your paper are wet and dry and what you actually want the paint to do, so that way it looks how you want it and you don't have any accidents, particularly where one color starts bleeding into another area. This happens a lot. Okay, so now that you've had some practice, we can get going on those portraits. When you go to clean up at the end of class, you need to make sure that there's no extra paint kind of around the paint pots, because you want to try and reduce the possibility of the colors bleeding into each other and getting contaminated, especially if there's any paint down here where the paintbrush lays. You need to take your paper towel and sop that up, otherwise you'll have a big sticky mess. Put the paintbrush in, close it on up. Now, make sure, you know, we just put a gigantic puddle of water in there. So what you need to do is carry your palette flat and actually leave it open so that it can dry. So just bring it over to my supply table, open, carry it flat so that it doesn't spill over into any of the other paint pots, and let it open to dry.